Hi, welcome to Chapter and Verse. I'm here today with Howard Bloom. Howard is one of the most brilliant, interesting, and successful people on this planet. Stay with Howard and me for this whole conversation, and you will be amazed by his life, his stories in the music industry, writing, and science. You're just going to be blown away. I am, so I hope you will be. I'm Rick Bleiweiss. Enough about me. Hi, Howard.
Rick, it's good to see you. One thing the audience should know, you and I have known each other for 45 years. It's astonishing.
And I'm proud of that, Howard.
Well, I'm proud of it too.
That's great. So let's go back a few years, even further than that. So you were interested in cosmology and microbiology before you were even 17. And then, right?
Actually, at the age of 10.
10.
What happened was this. I was a wildly unpopular child in Buffalo, New York. The only thing the other kids paid attention to me for was to grab my hat and throw it back and forth over my head, or chase me around the block, or in various ways to humiliate me. I was a lost child, and my parents had no time for me, none, and they didn't seem to have any interest in me.
Wow.
So, one day, I was sitting in my family's big living room in Buffalo, New York, and I had a book in my lap. And Rick, I don't know where it came from, because you know the location of every single book your parents possess by location.
Right.
And this book had no previous location. And there it was on my lap, and it said, the first two laws of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it told the story of Galileo all wrong, as if he'd been willing to go to the stake to defend his truth. It took me 30 years to find out that wasn't true. And then look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And it gave the example of Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope. And that was it. I finally had a tribe I could belong to. There was no way that Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek could pick up their baseball and bat and move to an entirely different lot just to avoid having to pick me for a team. It should happen to me. And the reason they couldn't reject me was because they were dead.
Oh.
So I was very slow to learn to read and write, but I started reading 2 books a day.
Wow.
And by the time I was 12, I co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. I built my first Boolean algebra machine. I was schlepped off to a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, my local university. And you'd think, what does the head of a graduate physics department want to have to do with a 12-year-old, for God's sakes? So I was ushered into his office, probably for a 5-minute courtesy meeting to satisfy my mom. And instead, we spent an hour discussing Big Bang versus steady state theories of the universe and the interpretation of the Doppler shift, which was the hottest topic that year in science. And he walked out of his office and put his hand on my shoulder and said to my mom, "You don't need to save for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships in theoretical physics at any school he wants." And then at 12, and there were other little things. When I was 12, my mom, who really had no interest in me, but sometimes did really good things, set me up with the head of research and development of the Moog Valve Corporation. Now, that may sound like plumbing. It's not. Those are the valves for the engines that powered the first plane to go faster than the speed of sound, the Bell X-1,
Wow.
and the first plane to take humans to the edge of space, the Bell X-2. And this guy's tutoring me in outside-the-box science, one-on-one. When I was 16, I got a summer job as a lab assistant at the world's largest cancer research institute, the Roswell Park Memorial Cancer Research Institute. And I was supposed to be working on cutting-edge immunology, but that wasn't my focus. At lunch, I gathered a little group of 19-year-olds, plus the scientists who'd been put over my head to make sure I didn't break too many multi-million-dollar photospectrometers, and brainstorm. And I was brainstorming about something called the CPT problem, the charge, parity, and time problem. With the problem is really this: if matter and antimatter are created in equal amounts at the same time, where's all the antimatter? And by the end of the summer, I had a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe that answered that question. and that predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for 38 years, dark energy. So that's when I was 16. But when I was 12, a very strange thing happened to me. I was realizing that I was an atheist. And my parents wanted to take me to high holiday services. It was the only thing they took seriously in the Jewish calendar. But they were adamant about it. So they got me into a suit. I have no idea of how they did it. I hated suits. They got me into their blue Fraser four-door automobile. They drove me all the way to Richmond Avenue, which is where the synagogue was. And at that point, I said, no, I'm not going any further. So my parents are dragging me by the ankles, try to get me out of the car. And I'm holding on to the sturdy American-made door frame with all my might. And I have a realization. Galileo achieved what he achieved by taking a device that was designed for horizontal viewing, so you could see an army coming over the horizon before they knew you could see them. And he turned it up to an unexpected place, the sky. Now, that was ridiculous. Everybody knew exactly what was in the sky. That was the bottom of God's living room rug. And God is perfect, so everything up there is perfect. And perfection, according to Aristotle, is circles. So it's all perfect circles. And what Galileo discovered is there are lumpy, craggy stones up there. That's what's in the sky. So Galileo changed the entire nature of science with that observation by looking in an unexpected direction, not horizontally, but up.
Yep.
And Anton von Leeuwenhoek did the same thing. He was a draper. He imported fabrics. He used a magnifying glass to look at fabrics horizontally to see how fine the weave was. And it occurred to him to change the direction of his lens and look down at pond water and human sperm, where, you know, you can imagine what his source of fresh human sperm was. So at any rate, so I'm being dragged by the ankles. My parents are trying to drag me up the sidewalk like a sack of meat. And I have a realization. If I'm an atheist, then there are no gods in the heavens and there are no gods below the earth. But there are gods in this picture. Where are they? They're in this gut deep passion of my parents about the high holidays. And if the gods of this kind exist in my parents, those elemental passions, then surely they exist in me. And I became fascinated by the ecstatic religious experience, which didn't exist in my synagogue, but I had a sense it existed somewhere. So I was off on a mission to find the gods inside. Meanwhile, I had nothing to do with popular culture because popular culture was the music of the kids who used to beat me up. Another thing that's, I had no interest in it. So I was listening to Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, and Stravinsky, and Mozart. Then, when I was 12 years old, something really weird happened. A girl in my 8th grade class swiveled her eyes in my direction. And Rick, no one had ever done that before.
Wow.
I was invisible to my classmates. And then she did something even more startling. She made eye contact.
Wow.
And she said, I told my mother you understand the theory of relativity. Well, back then, the reputation of the theory of relativity was that only 7 men in the world could understand it, and that was up from 3. So I didn't understand the theory of relativity, but the only thing I had going for me is the kids called me the sickly scientist. It was my scientific knowledge. So I jumped on my bicycle as soon as school let out. I pedaled as fast as I could to the local library. The librarians literally knew me better than my mother. They had been allowing me to read adult books, which was forbidden since the age of 10. And I said, give me everything you've got on relativity. And they scrambled around in the stacks and found a great big fat book by Einstein and 2 collaborators and a little tiny skinny book by Einstein himself. And so I put those in my bicycle clamp, drove home as fast as I could, went up to my bedroom and started reading the big fat book. Why? Because I had learned that if you do things the hard way, you end up getting things out of it that you're not going to get doing it the easy way.
Okay.
This book had approximately 7 words of English per page, and the rest was mathematical equations.
Wow.
And Rick, I've never understood mathematical equations in my life. So
Really?
by 8 o'clock that night, I was 50 pages into the book. And I had a sudden realization. My mom's going to put me to bed at 10 o'clock. If I don't understand the theory of relativity by the time I go to bed tonight, my goose is cooked tomorrow when I show up at school. So reluctantly, I turned to the little tiny skinny book. And I don't know if this has ever happened to you with a book, but I was reading the introduction, and it felt as if Albert Einstein himself had reached out through the pages, grabbed me by the front of my shirt, and said, put his nose up to mine, and said, "Schmuck, listen up. To be a genius, it is not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then explain it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it." So Einstein, through the pages of a book, was giving me my marching orders. The only role in life for me was to be an original scientific thinker, period.
Okay.
And he was saying, if you want to be an original scientific thinker, you have to be a writer, and not just any writer, a really delicious writer, a writer whose work people cannot put down. So I was under orders to become a writer.
Okay.
By Albert Einstein. And I became obsessed with my writing. And I wrote poetry, and I wrote prose, and I wrote nightly political commentaries 6 nights a week, and all kinds of things like that, just to get the hang of this. We'll fast forward, we'll skip over the stuff that's in my book, How I Accidentally Started the 60s, about how I accidentally contributed to the development of a new movement, the hippie movement. And we'll go directly to when I went back to college after 3 years of hitchhiking and riding the rails. So I decided to major in English literature in college so that the professors would stand over me with a whip and make me write so I could really perfect my writing. And I minored in psychology because science was my life. Science is in my bones and my marrow. It's in every rib I've got. You can't take that out of me. Now I needed to expand into a few other areas. And in my junior year, the poet in residence at NYU told me, "Look, Bloom, wait until everybody gets out of the classroom, close the door, I need to talk to you." And Rick, this did not sound good. Now, this poet in residence was convinced I would be the next great poet to come out of NYU. So I sat down in the bawling out seat, and he said, "Look, last year I asked you to be on the staff of a literary magazine. You never even showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You are the editor of the literary magazine.
Wow.
You don't even have a faculty advisor. When you walk out of this room, you are it. Now walk out of this room." So I walked out of the room looking terribly confused. And another student saw me and said, "You look troubled about something. Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I've just been named the editor of the literary magazine." And because my impression of literary magazines was that they all had these eggshell blue covers that put you to sleep. They all had this horrible typeface on the cover. And if you took a literary magazine, it was so boring that if you threw it into a room where there was a rip-roaring orgy, the room would be emptied in 5 minutes.
I think you're right.
So the student said, "Okay, why don't you come down with me for a cup of coffee and we'll discuss this." Now, Rick, I had not grown up among other human beings. I had guinea pigs, lab rats, and guppies in my room. Other kids wanted to have nothing to do with me. So I didn't know what "let's have a cup of coffee" meant, but I followed him obediently. And over a cup of coffee, I ordered a glass of water. He said to me, "If you could do anything you want with this magazine, what would it be?" And I said it would be a picture book.
Oh,
So
really?
I not only went out and found a literary staff, I went out and found an art staff. Now, when I graduated from NYU, the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo had been right. I got 4 graduate school fellowships, and they were in something that didn't exist yet. They were in neuroscience. I was going to have to paste the program together myself because there was no such thing yet. And at the beginning of the summer, I walked into the apartment of the most brilliant of the artists that I'd found. And the room was empty. There was a wall-to-wall rug. His wife, his child, 3-year-old child, and he were sitting on the bare rug, crying. And I wanted to know what the matter was. And they said, well, our furniture's just been repossessed. Our phone is being cut off, our electricity is being cut off, and we're about to be evicted from our apartment.
Wow.
I said, look, your work is brilliant. And if you put it in a portfolio and I take it around for 2 weeks, I'll get you enough work to pay your rent. And then you won't have this problem. So he said, well, look, I came down here to New York City to found an art studio with my best friend. And if you're going to take my work around, you have to take his work around too. Well, his best friend's work was appalling, abominable, nauseating. But I needed to save this guy from being out on the street. So I said yes. And his best friend's wife threw her work in, and she was good. She was an excellent designer.
That's good.
And I started taking this portfolio out. And by the end of the summer, I had New York Magazine interested in doing a feature on our studio.
Wow.
But I had sold absolutely nothing. And I realized at the end of the summer, if I go to grad school, I'd accepted Columbia. If I go to Columbia, it's going to be Auschwitz for the mind. Here I am, fascinated by the ecstatic experience and trying to rope it, feeling that my mission is to rope it into the realm of science. And how many ecstatic experiences am I going to see giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for a psychology credit? None. I'll spend my entire career divorced from what interests me the most. But I realized that this art studio that I'd helped found was a periscope position. In other words, it was a way to make it into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made, which is really the cutting edge, the stuff that really interested me. So I called Columbia and said, I have a back problem. I won't be coming this year. I'll come next year. And I kept going with the art studio. Well, over the course of the next 3 years, I made it on the cover of Art Direction magazine. I invented an animation technique new animation technique for NBC TV. And my studio did all of the graphics for all of ABC's 7 FM stations as they were transitioning in a very risky move, all 7 of them, from this well-known format of top 40 to an unknown format whose possibilities could have been destruction, called progressive radio.
Got it.
Cool. Album radio.
Yep.
So
AOR.
I was part of that. In fact, ABC asked me to create an advertising agency to handle their account. And I did not want to learn time buying, so I said no. But when I went up to ABC, the head of promotion used to take me aside and educate me about this stuff I knew nothing about, popular music and rock and roll. And one day, she said, when I walked into their office, because I was up there all the time, she said, look, we're having a concert in Studio B. If I gave you 2 tickets, would you come? So I said yes, and I got the brilliant artist that I bailed out from eviction and took him with me. There was a piano player on stage. My artist stood from the very first minute, from the very first chord the piano player played, and he yipped, and he hollered, and he wahooed at the top of his lungs, and I shrunk more and more, wishing I could hide under my seat because this was humiliating. Well, the piano player was named Elton John.
Oh, wow.
And the entire recording of all of this is his studio live recording. And you can hear Peter Bramley, my artist, yipping, hollering, and whooping in the background if you listen carefully to that record. And I realized something in my own career as a performer, that you pick the most enthusiastic person in the audience and you play to him or her, and then you try to spread the enthusiasm to the other members of the audience. But it's that most enthusiastic person who sustains you. Well, Peter Bramley was the most enthusiastic person in the room. So in a sense, Peter made the power of that concert.
Got it.
He was the one who fed Elton John the fuel to go ecstatic.
Right.
So, and another thing that happened to me when I was a kid that was very important in this, it would be very important. When I was 16, I was just as unpopular in high school as I'd have been in grammar school, even though my parents were kind enough to send me to this lovely private school called the Park School, which had 66 acres of greenery. It was a wonderful, wonderful place. And it was very kind of my parents to put out the money to do that because they could see I was withering. I wasn't paying any attention in school. I was reading books under the desk, for God's sakes. And I was just as unpopular as I'd been in grammar school. But there were certain functional, I was never going to be named class president because class president's the most popular kid in the class.
Right.
I was not going to be vice president because that's the second most popular kid in the class. I was not going to be named secretary because the secretary is the most popular girl in the class. And I was not going to be named treasurer because treasurer is the most popular Jew in the class. And I had no popularity whatsoever. But there were some functional committees that actually had to get stuff done. And I learned something in my first 2 weeks at the Park School. They said, we're going to divide you up in teams of 7 or 8, and we're going to have a fair to raise money. And each of you teams is going to have to come up with a booth of some sort that will make us money. And what I learned being in a room with 8 people up against the deadline of doing something real is that you go around the room and each person pisses on his territory. Each person stakes out where he stands.
Yep.
And that takes the first 15 minutes. And I did this at Polygram with you in the room once.
Really? I don't remember that, but I believe you.
And then after everybody has stated his position, there's an awkward silence. And that awkward silence is because none of these other 7 people have a clue as to what to do. So if you listen carefully and keep your mouth shut and wait until that awkward pause when people are desperate for leadership and you open your mouth, you're the leader. As unpopular as you might be, you're the leader. So they voted me the head of the program committee 2 years in a row. We had student assemblies for 45 minutes at the beginning of each morning, 5 days a week. I programmed 2 of those and I emceed all 5 of them. And at first I had stage fright for 2 months. It was awful.
Wow.
And then I finally got used to, it became totally natural to go in front of an audience of 350 people every day. So one day the juniors came to me and they said, we're about to have a dance. And we'd like you to promote it for us. Now, they didn't realize the irony of what they were asking. If there were any kind of social gathering in Buffalo, New York, especially a dance, I was invited to cordially park my feet as far away from that dance as possible, preferably Cleveland or Albuquerque. And so nonetheless, I decided to do the advertising for them. Now, Rick, I can't dance. Every 2 years, my parents would try to make me normal. And 1 year, their effort involved sending me to dance class. And I stood on the sidelines because no girl would dance with me. And the dance instructors occasionally would have mercy on me and dance with me and then regret it because I would mash their toes, stepping all over them.
I can relate to this because I can't dance either. So I get this.
So, we can't do the box step. We can't do the foxtrot. We can't do the waltz. But I decided, since I was advertising a dance, to dance. So I put a piece of music on the record player. I have no idea what it was. And I got up in front of the audience and I started to move. And I saw the face of the girl who hated me most in class melt. Really? I saw her pupils dilate. I saw her eyes widen. I saw that happen with all 350 other kids who hated me.
But why did that happen?
Well, here's the rest of the story. So their faces melted, and I saw them come together in a common energy. And I had an out-of-body experience. I was on the ceiling watching all of this take place. Okay. And I saw that collective energy of the audience mass like an amoeba and send a pseudopod like a tunnel out to me and send its energy through me as if I were an empty pipe on up to somewhere around my head where it became utterly transmogrified and flowed back to them. And I saw their eyes widening even further. And I saw their jaws hanging even further. And when it was all, and the reason for this was because I can't dance, I can't do anything conventional, period. I looked like a Looney Tune drawn on a night when Chuck Jones, the guy who created all the Looney Tune characters, had just dropped LSD. It was an insane sight. And when I was finished, the audience did something it had never done before and never did again at my time in this school. And it did it as if it had practiced it all their lives. They screamed down to the lip of the stage, the proscenium, and they picked me up and put me on their shoulders.
Really?
And they carried me out of the auditorium and on up the pathway to the building above where we had our classes, and only then did they put me down. It was an astonishing experience.
Wow.
And talk about the ecstatic experience. At that point, I'd been pursuing the ecstatic experience for 4 years. Well, guess what? I just had it.
Yeah.
But that would be a key experience in understanding my performers. So there I was at ABC and, you know, watching the Elton John concert and being schooled on rock and roll. And the art studio was in its third year. And now everybody was making a living every single week. And I was visiting a guy named, with my portfolio, I was visiting a guy named Matty Simmons. Matty Simmons had invented or helped invent this new thing for American Express called the credit card.
Really?
And
Oh, wow.
yes, and he had made a lot of money and now he wanted to be a publisher. So he bought the girls' magazine Ingenue, and then he had an idea. There was a magazine that Harvard kids put out every year, and it went on newsstands and sold out within 2 hours. So he went to the kids who put together the magazine that year, and he said, look, instead of just doing this once a year, why don't you do this once a month? I'll move you to New York City. I'll put you up in gorgeous apartments. I'll give you great big fat salaries, and you'll be able to sleep with any girl you want because you'll have such an impressive career. And so he started something called the National Lampoon.
Oh, wow.
And he asked me and my art studio to art direct it, which made sense. You know, here we were at the cutting edge of the avant-garde. So I went back downtown to 4th Street and 2nd Avenue, where my studio was, brought this project in, and remember the guy whose work was nauseating?
Mm-hmm.
Best friend of my most astonishing artist?
Yes.
He organized the studio he said, basically, if we throw Howard out of the studio, we have this great big fat check coming in every single month now. And if we throw him out, we can take his percentage.
Oh, wow.
But what he really, and he succeeded. He got me thrown out of the art studio. Half the artists left with me. But this was really a ploy to allow him to art direct the National Lampoon. And he did such an appalling job of it that after 7 issues, my former art studio, was fired. And my brilliant artist, who'd been sitting on the floor of his apartment crying, he went back to being an alcoholic, and he died at an early age, never having the national prominence that he should have had.
Oh, wow.
All the artists went back to obscurity again. But meanwhile, here I was trying to do what Albert Einstein told me to do, become a really superior writer. And I felt that my next step in doing this was to write for magazines, because I would have to write with just astonishing clarity and absolute deliciousness to be in magazines. So I did a project exploring drugs and sex in Meriden, Connecticut, in the suburbs for Esquire, but it didn't lead to doing an article. And then one day, now a few blocks away from my studio, there was the shop of a clothing designer. And I started not only buying her clothes, but co-designing clothes with her.
Wow.
So one day there was a new underground fashion magazine. It was funded by Baron Woolman, who had funded Rolling Stone, and it was in the garment district. No offices like this were in the garment district in those days. It was all industrial lofts.
Right.
And they had one of the industrial lofts. So I went up the creaky freight elevator, which is the only elevator they had, and stepped out expecting to put my portfolio on a table and see the three women in the room, ooh and ah. Didn't happen. The minute I stepped out of the elevator, these three women looked at what I was wearing and they said, "Do you have more of these?" And I said, "Yes, I've got a whole closet full of them. Why?" And they said, do you think you could write an article about them?" So I went home that night and wrote the article and brought it back to them. And that was the beginning of my magazine career. They made me a contributing editor. The magazine was called Rags, and I wrote 175 pieces for them.
Wow.
And meanwhile, another
I got to stop you. I got to stop you a second.
Okay.
What were you wearing that was so interesting to them?
I wish I could show you the pictures, because there are pictures that were published in Rags. It was an Indonesian batik, which was such a light cotton fabric that if you were walking in a pouring rain, which would happen periodically when I was headed uptown to an advertising agency, by the time you got into the elevator, your clothes were dry.
Wow.
And it was this wild, swirly, beyond paisley fabric, and a giant 3-inch belt that I had designed myself with a pouch that I had designed, a leather pouch.
Oh, cool.
That was it.
Okay.
And so at any rate, another one of the contributing editors to Rags started her own magazine, Natural Lifestyles, and she made me a contributing editor to that. And this meant that for my last year with the art studio, I was getting up every morning at 6 o'clock, going naked to my Remington manual typewriter, a typewriter from the 1940s, whose keys you had to hit with the force of a sledgehammer.
I remember those.
Yes. And I was writing until 8 o'clock in the morning, then putting on my Susan Harris clothes and going into the art studio, then coming home at night and sitting there from 8 o'clock until 11 o'clock at night with a pot of coffee, writing. And it was becoming tiring. So they had thrown me out of the art studio. I was covering a parapsychology convention for Natural Lifestyles. I had my usual pad. I always had my pad in my left hand and a pen in my right. And I was writing down every conceivable detail because I have no memory whatsoever. If I don't write it down, it's gone. And so this kid saw me and came up to me and said, "Would you like to edit a magazine?"
Wow.
Now, look, Rick, if I edited a magazine, I could do my writing during the day and wouldn't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to write.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, of course, yes. And I had just been thrown on my art studio, so I was free to do such a thing. And he got me an appointment with a publisher. Now, these days, we'd immediately Google the publisher's name, and we'd know what his magazine was, and we'd know what his background is. There was no Google in those days. There was no way to figure out even what the magazine was.
Right.
So I went to the appointed office on the appointed day. It was one of the most astonishing offices you've ever seen in your life. It had 7 windows overlooking the East River.
Oh, wow.
And it was way up on number 1 UN Plaza on the UN grounds. Johnny Carson in those days lived in the building. And you could see a ship miles up the river, and you could watch it as it progressed past you and as it went down another few miles on its way to the ocean. It was astonishing. And the publisher said, the magazine is called Circus. And I thought, okay, I don't really like circuses. I don't like clowns and elephants. But if I love my audience and have adequate research materials, I can write for anybody. And he said, no, it's not about circuses. It's about rock and roll. Well, all I knew about rock and roll was what I had learned at the offices of ABC. And it was minimal knowledge. But another thing to understand this, after my freshman year of college, in the summer after my freshman year of college, I was determined to get a job in writing.
Okay.
So I went through the New York Times and I listed every single agency that listed editorial jobs.
Okay.
And there were 98 of them. And I called the first 97 and they all said, sorry, we don't have anything. And then I reached the 98th and they said, could you come in tomorrow? We think we have something for you.
Wow.
And they got me a job with the Boy Scouts of America, whose national headquarters at that point was in New Brunswick, New Jersey.
Okay.
So I commuted down to New Brunswick, New Jersey, 90 minutes going, 90 minutes coming back every day, and wrote the first assignment they gave me was to rewrite the Boy Scout manual chapter on masturbation. Why they picked me for this, I do not know.
It's
And
great though.
But the old chapter said you shouldn't masturbate because your eyeballs will fall out and a long black hair 3 feet long will emerge from your left palm. And I had to come up with another reason not to masturbate because clearly the Boy Scouts were not going to come out in favor of masturbation. And I changed it to guilt. You will feel guilty.
Okay.
They apparently liked what I had done because then they gave me the Boy Scout handbook on stalking and tracking to rewrite. And they had a terrific research library, which was great.
Yeah.
And I genuinely, look, I can't find my way into a woods, Rick, much less out of one. Nonetheless, I wanted these kids, if they were stalking an animal, to get so close to a bunny rabbit that the rabbit didn't even know they were there until the two of them rubbed noses.
Okay.
And so I love my audience. I really wanted to serve them. And then they gave me their handbook on camouflage. Then they gave me a book called 10 Steps to Organize a Boy Scout Troop, which is the manual on how to organize a Boy Scout troop in a neighborhood that's never had one before.
Okay.
I mean, think of that, entrusting that to me. One
Yeah.
little irony, at the age of 11, I had been thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence at Morse code. And if they hadn't thrown me out for that, they could have thrown me out for incompetence in knot tying. But have you ever heard of a kid being thrown out of the Boy Scouts before?
No.
I haven't. And nonetheless, I was writing these seminal documents for the Boy Scouts. So when I was in the office of the publisher of Circus, I felt I could write for any audience if I genuinely loved them.
Yeah.
And the Circus audience I would later discover was the teen audience. I'd never had a teenagehood. So I'm suffering from teenagehood deprivation. And this would be a chance to vicariously live out my teenagehood.
Right.
Well, the only question, I mean, first of all, when I walked in to the office, there was a converted broom closet opposite this magnificent office. And in it were two people who were packing their bags. Those were the editors of Circus who had quit.
Oh, okay.
So the publisher's only question was this. He said, I've got to have a completed magazine at the printers in 2 weeks. Can you give me a completed magazine? Well, Rick, I had put together the literary magazine at NYU, and I'd done everything from picking the paper and the Ben days and to standing at the printing presses until 4 a.m. to make sure that they were properly inked to get across the visual magnificence of this thing that I created.
Right.
So, and sometimes you know something in your gut. I knew I could do it.
Yeah.
And I said yes. And that was the beginning of my immersion in rock and roll. And when I went to my first rock concert, it was Fleetwood Mac at Carnegie Hall.
Oh, cool.
Now, in those days, Fleetwood Mac, Chicken Shack, and Chicken Shack were two venerated but old blues bands from England.
Right.
And it was obvious that they were dying. Both bands were dying. Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham would not come along for many years.
Right.
So it's Carnegie Hall, approximately 3,200 seats. And I see how we all walk into the auditorium extremely self-conscious. We want to look cool to the people on either side of us. We want to look cool to the people behind us. So when we sit in our seats, we are doing our best to act a part.
Okay.
Then the lights go down and the lights go up on the stage and the band starts playing. And I watch as what happened to that audience that I was dancing for at Park School happens to all 3,200 of us at Carnegie Hall. We lose that self-consciousness.
Mhm.
We lose our envelope of personal identity. We merge in an ecstatic experience into the audience. And we do set out that pseudopod, that tunnel of energy
Yeah.
to the performers on stage. And they have an ecstatic experience. So we were half an hour into this, and all of a sudden, the lights went down on the stage, totally black. The sound system cut out completely, and the lights went on over the head of the audience. So we began to lose that special magic of being melded into something bigger than ourselves. And then Mick Fleetwood stepped to the edge of the stage. He's this 6'4" string man.
Yeah.
And he raised his fist and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are fucking going to rock and roll." And the band continued to play without a sound system.
Really?
All that was designed for its acoustics. And that moment of facing a common stress, a common threat, bonded us even more than we had been bonded before. And I suddenly saw that I had landed in the land where the gods are.
Okay.
In the land of the rituals that summon forth the ecstatic experience.
Yeah.
By accident, I had landed exactly where I needed to be. And I started studying rock and roll like a Talmudic scholar. I read News Musical Express and Melody Maker cover to cover. I read everything else I could find on the subject. My writers helped educate me. I did every educational maneuver I could, including listening to 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭's American Top 40, recording it and listening to it over and over again.
Yeah.
And I got to the point where I could identify any song in the top 40 by its first two notes, where I could tell you where every album from every band that I followed had peaked. In fact, a guy named Kurt Lassen from one of the syndicated wire services used to take me to lunch and pick my brain about where did this band peak? Where did that band peak?
Wow.
Where do you think they're going next? And I realized I was going to have to pull off something really ridiculous. Well, first of all, my publisher hit me with a challenge. He said, "I want this to read like Time magazine." Well, Rick, I had grown up reading Time magazine from cover to cover. And
Right.
my best friend and I always tied for first place in the Time magazine current events competition. We aced it. So I knew Time very well. And he said, there are these two magazines in Europe. One is 𝐟CB&x in France, and the other is Bravo in Germany. And each one sells 1 million copies in markets a fifth the size of the United States. So theoretically, a rock magazine should be able to sell 5 million copies in the United States. But Rolling Stone, the best-selling rock magazine, was only selling 250,000 copies.
Wow.
Far from that potential.
Right.
So he gave me the assignment of picking up the elements of success from Time magazine, Bravo, and 𝐿. So for a year, I studied those magazines intensely. I took them apart as if I were dissecting a frog. And then I came back to Jerry Rothberg, my publisher, and I said, if you give me sales figures and you allow me to do correlational studies, remember, I came from the world of science.
Right.
On the sales figures, I guarantee you I will increase your magazine in sales. Jerry was very reluctant. He'd never given that kind of information before, but he gave it to me. I did the correlational studies and I came back to him and said, I have a formula. It's going to break every rule that you've ever run by, but I guarantee you it's going to increase sales. And we started to use that formula. And in 12 months, we increased our circulation by 211%.
Wow.
And Jerry Rothberg, the publisher, went from being a man of modest means living on 2nd Avenue and 62nd Street to a man of outrageous means living in an apartment that overlooked the Hudson or overlooked the East River like his office did. His
Wow.
office, by the way, turned out to be Huntington Hartford's office, which is a whole different story that we won't go into here. We'll never get to the point. So Jerry, after a year and a half, came to me, my publisher, and said, "Don't you think it's about time you got a raise?" And, you know, I had never worked for anybody before. My first experience was founding my own art studio.
Right.
And so little niceties like raises had never occurred to me. So I decided, okay, I'll think about a raise. And I called my friends from Rags, who by then were working with Vogue and Harper's, and one of them was co-founding a magazine with Gloria Steinem called Ms. And I said, how much should I ask for in a raise? And they said, well, tell me what you do. So I made a list of what I do and called them back and told them. And they said, you should be asking for a 60% raise. You're doing the work of 2 people. Remember, I had replaced 2 people.
Right.
And so I went back to Jerry with a 60% raise. And he said, no, I can't afford that. And so I had to rescue my dignity somehow. Not that I ever noticed that I had dignity before. It was my first experience with it. And I gave him 6 months notice.
Oh.
And I found a terrific writer to replace me. And I wrote a 57-page booklet on how to turn out Circus Magazine, what the format was that I'd invented. I trained my replacement in that formula. And then I was without a job.
Okay.
My wife and I went to Barney's to buy some presentable clothing. And we bought these clown pants. We bought these checkered pants that were voluminous. What inspired us, I do not know. It was the perfect way to never get a job. And I was getting a little bit desperate. And I mean, I'd had a terrific interview at a new magazine for single women. The women who were editing the thing loved me, absolutely adored me. But then they sent me in for a meeting with the publisher, who was a man, and the stuff that went over with women and bowled them over was a challenge to this dominant male. So I didn't get that job. Well, the writer that I was grooming to be my editor replacement said, there's somebody I want you to meet. And he introduced me to, the founder of Sire Records, Seymour Stein, who would later go on to discover Madonna. At that point, he had Echo and the Bunnymen and Pet Shop Boys and the Climax Blues Band and Renaissance and a bunch of people like that.
Right.
So Seymour Stein got me a job creating an public and artist relations department from scratch. For Gulf and Western's 14 record companies, because he was one of Gulf and Western's 14 record companies. And I worked my tail off, and the company was constantly losing money, but they were constantly allowing me to hire more staff when they were asking everybody else to pare down.
Wow.
And I didn't really register how strange that was. And then a year later, they sold, by the way, meanwhile, one day, the A&R guy for Paramount Records, which was one of our big losers, came into my office. A&R, for those who don't know the term, means talent scout.
Right.
And this guy was a wonderful enthusiast. And every day he would walk into my office with another amazing discovery who was going to be a gonzo, a gorilla, a smash, and yada yada, which was one of his phrases, yada yada. And I listened with admiration for his enthusiasm. And the minute he walked out, I went to work on things that were actually going to work. But one day he walked into my office with a proposition I couldn't dodge. He said he had found this gorilla, this monster, this smash. It was a 13-year-old girl from Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And I was, prepared to dismiss the whole idea as soon as he walked out of the room. And he said, but I have a showcase for her tomorrow at the Plaza Hotel.
Wow.
Now, my office was on the 23rd floor of what was then the Gulf and Western building. Today it's a Trump building at Columbus Circle. And it was just a short and extremely pleasant walk through Central Park from my office to the Plaza Hotel.
Right.
And I was head of artist relations. So I had to let the artists know that we were or were not paying attention to them, but one way or the other, I had to make contact. I was always very honest with the artists. So I went to this little nightclub with tiered, semicircular, amphitheater-like settings. So one table is on this level, the table above it is on this level, the table behind that is on this level.
Right.
And we all waited for something to happen. And then suddenly this 4'8" presence took over the stage. And it was as if she had grabbed you by the esophagus.
Wow.
And pulled her nose up to yours and was singing and locked her eyes on yours and was singing directly into your very soul. It was an astonishing experience. Well, meanwhile, our president.
Wait, who
Tony
was it, or are you
Martell,
going to get to that?
her name is Stephanie Mills.
Oh, sure.
And
Okay.
so meanwhile, our president, Tony Martell, had a son who'd come down with leukemia.
Right.
So Tony was coming into his office at 9 o'clock. No other record company president does that. They come in at 11 because they have to go out at night and check out acts.
Right.
He was locking himself behind his big oak doors and disappearing for the day. He was researching the top researchers on leukemia to try to save the life of his son. So we were operating headless, which for me is terrific. I do my best work when you just let me the fuck go, period. But apparently, I mean, we had another company, Gulf and Western had another company that was in it's what we're now called its golden years. It was producing film after film after film that was a blockbuster. And the president of that company was a 5'4" titan with a reputation of being anywhere from a Hitler to a Napoleon. And he went to the guys who ran Gulf and Western and apparently said, look, I'm making you tons of money. That pissant little record company is making you nothing. It's losing you money. If you put that record company under my thumb, I will make it make money. So one day we all walked in and there was a room. We all thought of it as the Xerox room because it was never lit. The light was never on. But there were boxes and boxes and boxes of Xerox paper, which in those days we used tons of.
Right.
Well, one day we walked in and there were no Xerox papers in that room, no Xerox boxes. And the door was open, the room was brightly lit. And it turned out that those Xerox boxes had been on top of a conference table. This was a conference room. None of us knew that. And we were summoned to a staff meeting at 10 o'clock. So we all showed up at the conference table, and in front of each of us was an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with a list of 14 records we'd never heard of, and a nice legal pad and a sharpened pencil. And Tony Martell walked in, he was 6'2", and said, we're losing money, we have to save money on sharpened pencils and legal pads. And as he was making this, we've got to save money speech, we felt a presence at the door behind us.
Oh.
And it was as if 1,000 laser beams had gone off. Remember that cloud in Michelangelo's painting of God giving the gift of life to Adam? It was as if that cloud was behind us, lightning bolts and thunder. And in walked this man who we didn't recognize as 5'4" because he was such an astounding presence. And as he walked down the length of the table toward the head where Tony was, Tony shrank and shrank and shrank. He was slumping further and further into his seat. And finally, he slid off of his seat like a jellyfish, took the seat next to it, and Frank Yablans, the president of Paramount Pictures, took over the center, took over the head of the table. And he said to the staff, to the guy at his immediate left, the department head. He looked at the list of records that none of us had ever heard of. He said, you, what are you doing about this record? Meaning record number 1. Now I had heard about bullshitting in oral exams. I had never seen an oral exam and hadn't really seen it at work. Now I saw it. It came to life. This guy made up an astonishing story with great details. about all the things he was doing for this record he'd never heard of. Then Martel got to department head number 2. And department head number 2 did the same thing all over again with another vivid, astonishing, energetic story. And then Martel got to me. And I stood up and I said, Mr. Martel, I'm not doing anything about any of these records on this list. We don't even know the phone numbers for the presidents of the companies. They're phantoms. To us, they don't exist and they're not going to go anywhere. But yesterday I saw a girl named Stephanie Mills. She's getting 40% of my time. And I described what had happened when Stephanie Mills had taken to the stage. Frank 𝐃𝐨𝐽 didn't say a word. As soon as I was finished, he walked out of the room. And you know how there's something you don't really notice going on when a dozen people are trying to get out of one door and there's a scrum, they're all crammed up against each other. So as we were scrummed in the exit from that room, the vice president who had hired me grabbed me by the arm with a grip so tight that I had the marks of his fingers on my arm for a week. And he said, "You fucking none. If you ever do that again, you're fired."
Wow.
Well, when I got to my office, my secretary was standing 30 feet outside the office, really waiting anxiously for me. And she said, Mr. Martel or Mr. 𝐃𝐨𝐽's office called, the president of Paramount Pictures. He is gathering all of his department heads tomorrow at noon, and he wants you and Stephanie Mills. So I scrambled Stephanie Mills and we showed up at that meeting. And then Stephanie Mills got the lead role in the first all-Black musical, the first musical produced by Blacks, written by Blacks, directed by Blacks, called The Wiz.
Yeah.
And she got the role of Dorothy. And since then, she's had 15 gold records. You know, she never reached the heights that I wanted, but she did manage to do pretty well.
Yes, she did.
So after the end of a year, our Gulf and Western's record holdings were sold to ABC Records. And a vice president flew from ABC in LA to New York, gathered all of us. There were over 50 of us. We had never been in a room together before. We had never all seen each other before. And said, there will be no blood flowing in the corridors of this company. Just go on about your business as usual. So I immediately went to my staff of 5 people and said, we've got trouble. Drop everything that you're doing and find every clipping that we've ever had, every radio appearance we've ever created, every television appearance we've ever generated, and use standard rate and data service and figure out what that would have cost if that time and space had been purchased in advertising dollars.
Right.
So they did. And the results floored me. The results were that for every $1 Gulf and Western had spent on our department, they'd gotten $11 worth of coverage.
Wow.
Well, it was the middle of winter. And you know how in Manhattan, because you used to be in Manhattan,
Yep.
on a snowy day, everything clogs up and people are willing to do something that they don't normally do. They're willing to share cabs.
That's right.
So when you get a cab, the cab driver says, do you mind if I stop at 52nd Street
Right.
and pick up another passenger? So we picked up another passenger in the midst of this blizzard. And I told the story of how we derived this figure of $11 for every dollar spent to this advertising executive from _𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐜𝐫𝐽, one of the hottest agencies at the time. And he said, no, your arithmetic is all wrong. And I thought, yeah, it was too good to be true. I knew there was some flaw in there somewhere. And he said, no, you don't understand. In advertising, we count every inch of editorial as worth 5 times as much as an inch of advertising because it has 5 times the credibility. So you didn't deliver $11 for every dollar invested in your department. You delivered $55.
That was a great cab ride.
Exactly. It saved my life. So at any rate, 2 weeks later, every single person who'd been in that room and had been told to go about his business was pink slipped.
Wow.
With the exception of one. And that one was me.
Wow.
And I resigned. And I resigned because they were firing my staff.
Okay.
And I had done the work of 2 people at Circus. And then to replace me, they had hired 5 people.
Wow.
So I'd essentially done the work of 5 people. And I never wanted to do that again.
Sure.
I needed an organization beneath me.
Right.
So when I quit, that same vice president flew in. It felt like he was in my office 2 hours later. He obviously took an overnight. That couldn't have been. And he walked into my office and he said, "Get out a sheet of blank paper." And I got out a sheet of blank paper. And he said, "Write down your name at the top. Write down the names of all of the staff people you want to keep. And write down the salaries you want." So I gave us all a 20% raise.
Okay.
And all of a sudden, we were the first public and artist relations department on the East Coast for ABC Records.
Wow.
And now, when I entered ABC had something we had never had at Gulf and Western. ABC had a record at number 3 on the pop charts.
Okay.
So I went to pick up the manager for the act that was number 3. Nobody else was paying any attention to this act because the lead singer was Black. And in those days, it was not hip for white people to work with Black artists, as crazy as that sounds. Absolutely insane. The manager was Diana Ross's husband.
Wow.
And the father of Tracy Ellis Ross, who was an infant at the time. And I went out in a limousine to pick him up at the airport when he flew in from California. And I had ulterior motives. It was rush hour. I knew we would be baked in traffic for an hour and a half, and that I would have him as a captive in that limousine. And I said, "Look, I know your act prides itself on its democracy. Every member is equal to every other member." It was a mixed Black and white band. And I said, "But if you allow me to focus all of the attention on the lead singer, I guarantee, and you cover my ass with the band, I guarantee you I will give you a star." Now, I've only said that possibly twice in my lifetime.
Wow.
Because I'm not going to tell you that unless I know it at the very level of my gut.
Right.
And he let me do it. And the singer's name was 𝐬𝐲𝐿 Khan.
Oh, wow.
So we were very successful at ABC. And then I used to get calls from the 34th floor of the ABC building asking me to come up. That's where they had their original Picassos and their private dining rooms and their private chefs. And a guy named Martin Pompadour had been trying to figure out the mystery of CBS Records' success.
Okay.
And I kept showing him the structural reasons that ABC was so successful. No matter who was president, it had 33% of the record market, which is astonishing.
Yeah.
Despite every change in president it ever went through, that was consistent. So I had been analyzing the structural reasons and tried to get those across to him. Plus, I tried to get across to him that the name of the game was not hits.
Okay.
The name of that used to be hits, but the name of the game now was touring.
Okay.
The bands that toured the most successfully ended up selling the most albums, and albums were where the profit was generated.
Right.
So a record company had to be an artist development company.
Yep.
Marty listened. He called me up over and over again to give him these lectures, but then he finally decided that the reason CBS was so successful was because its most successful president was Clive Davis, and Clive Davis had a law degree, had been a lawyer.
Okay.
So what he needed to do was hire a lawyer. No, Clive Davis was successful because he had golden ears.
Right, absolutely.
And Martin Pompadour had missed the point. So he hired a lawyer to head the company. And they decided to purge everybody in the company and start all over from scratch. So I was sent out into the wilderness. I was fired. By the way, at one point, after the deal had been made to sell Paramount or all of the Gulf and Western operations to ABC, I had gotten a call from a lawyer who negotiated the deal on behalf of Gulf and Western. And he said, you know why we were able to sell that little pissant record company for so much money, don't you? And I said, I haven't got a clue because this is not my specialization.
Right.
And he said, because of you. And I said, that's impossible. I know nothing about the business end of things. And he said, no, listen to me. You had been doing such a successful job for Dot Records, which was number 3 in the country in Western Field and trying to get to number 1, and for Sire Records, which was Seymour Stein's company,
Right.
that you doubled the value of our company. And when the reason they didn't fire you was because as soon as the transaction took place, Seymour Stein and Jim Fogelsong, the president of Dot Records,
Right.
flew out to California to meet with the president of ABC Records. And they said, if you get rid of Howard Bloom, you will get rid of us.
Wow.
We will continue with you. So this was startling to me.
Wow.
Because, you know, I never did this for money. I was doing it for the love of an intense experience in the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. But when they hired the lawyer, I was fired.
Wow.
So along with everybody else.
Yep.
The new president, the lawyer, absolutely destroyed ABC Records in a year. It
Oh, I
only
believe
took
it.
him a year. And he had written a contract for himself with ABC that gave him the first golden parachute that said, if you are fired, if I am fired, you will give me $20 million.
Wow.
Right. Which at that point was a lot of money.
Yeah. Still a lot of money, Howard.
Right. So at any rate, now I was on my own. Now, one day when I'd been sitting in my cubicle at ABC Records, Seymour Stein had stuck his head in and said, Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company? Now you can challenge me on a huge number of normal human activities in which I am really subpar. I can't catch a baseball. I can't throw a baseball. When I go to the dog beach every day and a dog brings me a ball to throw out into the water for him to fetch, my throwing is pathetic. It's a miracle I makes it all the way to the water. But if you challenge me on smarts, that's the only area that I have. So that stuck with me. And when I was fired from ABC, Danny Goldberg, who would later be the president of Atlantic and the president of Polygram Records, called and said, look, why don't you start your own company? You can start it on my living room in 74th Street. You can start it on my coffee table. And I have an assistant. And if you pay half her salary, I will share it with you.
Wow.
Share her with you.
Yeah, right.
So I took him up on the deal and started my own company. And it was deliberately called the Howard Bloom Organization because I need to build organizations. I cannot do these things on my own.
Right.
With the exception of my books, which I have to do entirely on my own. So I left with Stephanie Mills as a client and ZZ Top as a client. And now remember, I was in search of the gods within. And with ZZ Top, I found them. And I just realized it's 7:14. So we should cut off at that point in the narrative so I can do my work. But so that's the beginning.